Your ex is a narcissist. Your boss is a narcissist. Your mother-in-law is a narcissist. That friend who posts too many selfies? Definitely a narcissist. Except, statistically, they're probably not, because actual narcissistic personality disorder affects less than 1% of the population. Yet if you spend any time on social media, it seems like narcissists are everywhere. So what's really happening? Is there actually an epidemic of narcissism, or have we just turned a clinical diagnosis into a trendy insult? In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the difference between real narcissism and narcissistic behavior, why social media is making everyone seem more narcissistic, and the uncomfortable truth about why we're so quick to label people with this diagnosis. Because the answer is more complicated and more interesting than you think. Let's start with what narcissistic personality disorder actually is, because most people get this completely wrong. NPD is a diagnosable mental health condition listed in the DSM-5, the manual psychologists use to diagnose disorders. It's characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. But here's the critical part. It has to be consistent across time and situations, cause significant impairment, and be present since early adulthood. Someone who posts a lot of selfies isn't a narcissist. Someone who talks about themselves constantly isn't necessarily a narcissist. Someone who hurts you in a relationship isn't automatically a narcissist. Real narcissistic personality disorder is a complex psychological condition with deep roots in childhood development, usually involving trauma, neglect, or unstable early attachment. It's not just being selfish or self-absorbed, but somewhere in the last few years, narcissist became the go-to label for anyone who's difficult, self-centered, or emotionally hurtful. TikTok is full of videos about narcissistic abuse. Instagram influencers talk about identifying narcissists. Everyone seems to have dated one. And look, I'm not saying narcissistic abuse isn't real. It absolutely is, and the people who've experienced it deserve validation and support. But we've reached a point where the word has lost almost all clinical meaning. It's become a catch-all term for bad behavior, and that's actually dangerous for several reasons I'll get to. So let's break this down. What's actually happening? Are there really more narcissists now than 30 years ago, or is something else going on? Here's where things get interesting. Research actually does show an increase in narcissistic traits, particularly in younger generations. A study analyzing data from over 47,000 college students between 1979 and 2009 found significant increases in narcissistic personality traits. Students scored higher on measures of vanity, entitlement, and exploitativeness compared to students from previous decades. But here's what that study doesn't tell you. Narcissistic traits are not the same as narcissistic personality disorder. Traits are behaviors and tendencies. Disorder is a pervasive pattern that causes dysfunction. So what's driving the increase in narcissistic traits? The answer is pretty obvious if you think about it. Social media. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. They're essentially narcissism training platforms. Think about what they reward. Self-promotion, curated perfection, constant validation seeking, comparing yourself to others, and performing your life for an audience. Every time you post a selfie and check how many likes it gets, you're engaging in narcissistic behavior. Every time you craft your profile to make your life look better than it is, you're engaging in narcissistic behavior. Every time you feel a rush when someone comments on your post, that's your brain getting rewarded for narcissistic traits. This doesn't mean you have a personality disorder. It means you're responding to the incentive structure of the platform. Social media essentially gamifies narcissism. It takes behaviors that were once considered vain or self-absorbed and makes them not just normal, but necessary for social participation. If you're not promoting yourself, you're invisible. If you're not curating your image, you're falling behind. If you're not seeking validation through likes and comments, you're not using the platform correctly. And this creates a feedback loop. The more narcissistic behavior gets rewarded, the more people engage in it. The more people engage in it, the more normal it seems. The more normal it seems, the more extreme you have to be to stand out. A study from York University found that people who post more selfies score higher on measures of narcissism and psychopathy. But here's the question. Were they narcissistic before they started posting selfies, or did posting selfies make them more narcissistic? The research suggests it works both ways. Narcissistic people are drawn to social media because it offers endless opportunities for admiration. But social media also creates narcissistic traits in people who weren't particularly narcissistic before. You're not imagining it. People really are more self-absorbed, validation-seeking, and image-obsessed than they used to be. But that's not a character flaw. That's an adaptation to an environment that rewards those behaviors. Now, here's where this gets uncomfortable, and I need you to stay with me, because this is important. If social media is training all of us to behave more narcissistically, then calling someone else a narcissist might just be a way of avoiding looking at your own behavior. Think about it. When you call your ex a narcissist, you make yourself the victim and them the villain. It's a clean story. They're disordered, you're traumatized, end of discussion. But what if they're just someone who hurt you? What if they were selfish or emotionally immature or bad at relationships, but not actually diagnosable with a personality disorder? What if you're using clinical language to avoid the messier reality that sometimes relationships fail because two people weren't compatible or because both people made mistakes? Here's the truth that nobody wants to hear. We're overdiagnosing narcissism because it gives us a simple explanation for complex relationship problems. Narcissistic personality disorder is actually quite rare. Estimates range from 0.5% to 1% of the general population. Yet if you look at social media, you'd think 50% of people are narcissists. This matters for several reasons. First, when we call every selfish person a narcissist, we dilute the term. People who are actually experiencing narcissistic abuse, the kind that involves systematic gaslighting, manipulation, and psychological torture, they get lumped in with people who just dated someone self-centered. Second, it stops us from taking responsibility in relationships. If your ex is a narcissist, you're a victim, and there's nothing you could have done differently. But if your ex was just emotionally immature or incompatible with you, then maybe there are patterns you need to look at. Maybe you ignored red flags. Maybe you have your own attachment issues. Maybe you stayed too long hoping they'd change. I'm not saying abuse victims need to take responsibility for their abuse. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that not every bad relationship is abuse, and not every hurtful person has a personality disorder. Third, and this is the big one, narcissism has become a moral judgment disguised as a diagnosis. When you call someone a narcissist, you're not just describing their behavior. You're saying they're fundamentally bad, irredeemable, incapable of change. And maybe some people are. Real narcissistic personality disorder is notoriously difficult to treat, partly because people with NPD rarely think they have a problem. But most people who get called narcissists on the internet are just flawed humans doing their best in a culture that rewards self-promotion and punishes vulnerability. Here's something else to consider. The same generation that's diagnosing everyone with narcissism is also the most anxious, depressed, and self-critical generation in history. We're constantly comparing ourselves to others, feeling inadequate, seeking validation, and tearing ourselves down. That's not narcissism. That's the opposite of narcissism. Real narcissists have inflated self-esteem and lack self-doubt. Most people on social media have fragile self-esteem and constant self-doubt. What looks like narcissism is often actually deep insecurity masked by a carefully curated online persona. Dr. Craig Malkin, who literally wrote the book on narcissism, argues that healthy narcissism exists on a spectrum. A certain amount of self-focus, pride in your achievements, and desire for recognition is normal and even healthy. The problem is when it becomes extreme and rigid. When someone can't feel good about themselves without putting others down. When they can't handle any criticism. When they lack empathy entirely. But we've started treating any amount of self-promotion or confidence as pathological narcissism. And that's just not accurate. So how do you actually tell the difference between someone who's genuinely narcissistic and someone who's just behaving narcissistically because of social media or insecurity? Here's the test. Genuine narcissists lack empathy consistently across all contexts. They can't put themselves in someone else's shoes. They genuinely don't care about other people's feelings except as tools to get what they want. Someone who's just insecure or social media addicted will still show empathy in other areas. They'll feel bad when they hurt someone. They'll apologize and mean it. They'll have genuine friendships based on mutual care. Narcissists don't. Their relationships are transactional. Their apologies are manipulations. Their empathy is performative. If your ex had moments of genuine connection, vulnerability, and care, they're probably not a narcissist. They might have narcissistic traits. They might have hurt you. They might have been a terrible partner. But that's not the same thing. Here's what I want you to take from this video. Social media is absolutely increasing narcissistic behavior. We're all more self-focused, validation-seeking, and image-conscious than previous generations. That's not a moral failing. That's a response to the environment we're living in. But narcissistic behavior is not the same as narcissistic personality disorder. And using clinical language casually actually hurts the people who are genuinely dealing with personality disordered individuals. If you experienced abuse, manipulation, gaslighting, and systematic psychological torture, your experience is valid whether or not your abuser meets clinical criteria for NPD. You don't need a diagnosis to justify your pain, but if you're calling everyone who hurt you a narcissist, you might want to ask yourself why. Are you avoiding looking at patterns in your own behavior? Are you making yourself the victim in every story? Are you using psychology vocabulary to avoid the messy reality of human relationships? The paradox is this. The more we focus on identifying narcissists out there, the more we might be engaging in the same black and white thinking, lack of nuance, and inability to see other perspectives that characterizes narcissism itself. Real narcissists don't think they're narcissists. They think everyone else is the problem. Sound familiar? I'm not saying you're a narcissist. I'm saying we're all living in a culture that's making us behave more narcissistically, and maybe instead of pointing fingers, we should be asking how we can be more empathetic, less image-focused, and more genuine in a world that rewards the opposite. Social media isn't going anywhere. But you can choose how much you participate in the narcissism it creates. You can choose to be vulnerable instead of curated. You can choose to validate yourself instead of seeking it from others. You can choose to see people as complex instead of diagnosing them. Your ex might have been terrible, but they probably weren't a clinical narcissist. They were probably just a person who hurt you, and that's enough. You don't need a diagnosis to justify leaving. You don't need a label to explain why it didn't work. Sometimes people are just incompatible. Sometimes people are just selfish. Sometimes people are just not ready for a relationship. And that's okay to acknowledge without pathologizing it. Leave a comment with one word. Narcissist or not? Do you think we're overusing the term? Or do you think there really are more narcissists than ever? I'm genuinely curious where people land on this because it's one of the most polarizing topics in psychology right now. And if this video made you think differently about how we use psychological labels, share it with someone who's been throwing around the word narcissist a little too freely. Words matter. Diagnoses matter. And understanding the difference between a personality disorder and a personality flaw matters. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.